Hey everybody, welcome back to the Prehospital Paradigm Podcast. I'm Scott Wildenheim. Got the regular crew here. I've got Ray Pace here to my right, Dr. John Hill, and our guest today, Don Zimmerman.
Well, hello there.
Hello there.
Hello.
Don, a little bit about yourself for the world, really. I mean, locally, very well known. You've had major contributions in this area, specifically in education, but yeah, for the rest of the audience, what's your background, Don?
Well, I was a volunteer firefighter for 30 years, and then a career lieutenant paramedic for 25.
25.
Yep. I've taught medic school in the past, and now I pretty much just teach for university hospitals. Yep.
Yeah, and you are the brains behind our mobile simulation lab and all of our highly modified mannequins that if you can't find what you want,
just build it.
You got to build it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So we've got some really cool hemorrhaging mannequins, because of this man. So this is some excellent stuff. We want to talk today about some mass casualty incident stuff, and you have some of your other background is you did some disaster work here for the hospital and whatnot, and have really proposed some kind of mindset changes on how we're gonna handle mass cal in the future. And that's really what I want to kind of get into is we'll talk about the whole structure and where we're at and some of the stuff that we historically have been taught textbook wise, and then I certainly want to hear from you on what we need to change to grow and evolve with the growing and evolving threats, right?
Sure.
Let's touch on that just a little bit. How did you get to thinking about we need to do this differently, and that there's these gaps?
So with all the active shooter education that's come out in the last several years, TECC, Rescue Task Force, two things. Number one is all of our mass casualty training. If you open up any EMT book or paramedic book in the country, you're still going to see the same thing. You're going to see the tarps. You're going to see the flags. You're going to see people organized in certain areas. And then when you're watching the news with specifically these violent events, active shooter, the Boston bombing, it doesn't look anything like that.
Nothing like it ever.
And so here we are in paramedic school and EMT school, and we're telling them, here's the tag, here's how you fold it, here's what you do, and here's how you put this. And then you get a real mass casualty incident, even if it's only 10 victims in your town, and there's no tags used.
None of it happens.
And so it finally came down to the turning point for me was back in 2012 when the Aurora, Colorado Century 16 shooting occurred. Yeah. And as I was reading some of the data from that the one report was that there were 17 critically injured, and that 12 of the 17 critically injured were transported by police. And as an instructor and as a functioning paramedic I'm like, why? Is this where we want to be?
Right, yeah.
What are we doing wrong? I'm not saying they did anything wrong, and probably putting them in the police car was the best thing to do at that time, and it probably saved lives. But is that really where we want to be? The more you read that after action, you start to see that they treated over 100 people, that they triaged over 100 people, and yet there were only 70 people injured, and they didn't see the most severe. So basically, as they were setting up, as we're trained to do, they're getting hit with this wave of people going, help, help, my girlfriend got blood on her shoe or whatever.
Right.
And the people, the police officers are looking like, we got somebody dying here.
Critically
so they're
injured,
their best choice was put them in the police car. So I don't think you're ever going to get away from that chaos. But the question is, are we teaching what we really should be teaching, or should we be reprioritizing? Right. So that's what started in my mind, and then I just started calling a bunch of friends and associates and professionals, and just started bouncing ideas. And then we started looking at a white paper that was developed in the country in regards to this. It all started with Columbine. Like, do we really want police to wait for SWAT, or do we want them to move in and take out the shooter? Do we really want EMS to stage for a safe scene, or do we want to wait for maybe a warm zone, like we do with hazmat? And so we really just started working on that, trying to use every resource we could find.
And then the fundamental shift here, and all those things you described in the space of, say, active shooter or a rapidly evolving event like that.
Mm-hmm.
In a case of a more static event, all the things that we were taught in school are still applicable, right?
They are
in most cases, but we were just trying to overlay that onto very dynamic events that quickly outstretch those capabilities to set it up and to manage it.
That's right. And the triage system that we have was designed based on that casino bus on the interstate flipped over.
Yeah.
I mean, first of all, you're going to have a range. You've got some people who aren't hurt. You've got some greens, some yellows, some reds. You've got a pretty good and maybe some blacks. You have a good span, like you might have an even number of reds and yellows, and it's easy, and nobody wants to go anywhere. They can't go anywhere. If you tell the greens sit by the guardrail, they're going to sit by the guardrail.
Right.
Because what else are they going to do? It's not like they got their car. And so that system works in that where we can put all the people here. When we get to an active shooter event, picture a festival in your town, in your city, where all of a sudden you've got this chaos. For the first time in triage, we actually have a reason to leave. Like if you're there with your spouse and a paramedic says, here, come over and sit on the red tarp, or hey, come over here, we'll get you an ambulance. Right. You're like, I don't see an ambulance. That guy's still shooting.
I don't want to be here.
I know where the hospital is. I'm going.
Right, yeah,
and so that's exactly why we see all these POVs and police cars transporting. So how do we build that into a system? And the answer is, like you said, Scott, you're not gonna have one system. You need to have two.
Yeah.
You need to have a static, and you need to have a dynamic.
And that's really what it's really what you're proposing as far as the fundamental change to how we approach these things. Is your first decision point is essentially, is this a dynamic or a static event?
Absolutely, and it blurs because you can have a dynamic event that turns into a static event.
Yep.
And so really we're not trying to say you have to declare and then you're offensive or defensive.
Yeah.
What you're going to do is you're going to just say, well, this appears to be more of a dynamic. It's changing. We don't have all the information. People want to get out of here. These things tend to work better based on after actions from all these professionals who have done this. Based on what they did, this tends to work best for this situation, and this tends to work better for this situation. So we just give you more tools to try to figure out what's the best to do in that situation.
Yeah, because in history we were all taught, like Donnie said, just that static event, the bus crash. If you even look at RPM and triaging systems. I mean, that video has been around for a very long time, and that's how we've trained a lot of people over the years, is just the firefighter walks into the bus, there's 20 people in the bus, it shows you them triaging everybody, makes it look like a very simple concept, which start triage is, and it's not chaos, people running everywhere, you're on the street, this widespread scene versus focused just into the inside of this bus. So I think it's good to have the options versus this is what we were always taught for that.
And it was the best we had.
Yeah, at that time, yes, 100%. And that was, things have evolved. We learn more and more after each one of these events, and then we have to continue to adapt.
Yeah. Well, communications changed too. So if Columbine was a great example of having cell phones actually in schools and having 911 calls go out from inside the school. Right. That was new for cell phones, right? Nowadays, everyone's got a cell phone. Everyone's got a camera on it, which we've talked about in the past. So now hey, someone's shooting me and I'm at this theater. Come get me, right? And so now you're having people come to pick up those wounded or think that they're wounded and rushing to the hospital, and that wasn't happening again. It wasn't happening to the classical bus on the side of the road, flipped over. Everyone can be triaged in a more controlled setting than what's happening right now.
Yeah, the technology makes that incident more complex because now how many of those students, just back to the cell phone point, are now streaming that on Facebook Live? Yep. How many 911 calls are now flooding into your 911 center? Let's move it to like a larger industrial setting or a business or a school. every person in that classroom, 25 kids in a classroom, they're going to be calling in. So you're getting all these different reports and all this information, and it's just even overwhelming the dispatch center at the first stage of it as that event starts. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think all of us have called 911 at some point. I'm driving by, I see an accident happen. I witnessed the accident call, and no sooner than I'm calling, like, yeah, we've already gotten 5 calls.
Five calls on
Yes.
it, right? Yeah.
Because everyone has that.
Are you
communication.
calling about? That's
Yeah.
what, that's what
Yes.
I've got, right? Are
Yeah.
you calling about the?
Yep.
Yeah.
All right, thanks.
So it turns out I am. Okay.
You are good.
Damn, impressive.
And the technology also plays another factor. There's been a couple of these active shooter events where a mass casualty where all of a sudden they've got to report the shooting at the hospital now. Like it's moved to the hospital and they're closing down a hospital. Like, oh no, don't take them there now. There's a shooting there and the law enforcement's trying to get there. And then they find out, no, it never actually happened. It was something that was overheard, mistaken from the scene, who got carried over to the hospital.
Or someone at the scene calls to notify the hospital, hey, we've got a mass casualty developing. They're going to start going on lockdown, preparing for this influx of people. That gets misconstrued as, oh, there's a shooting
There's
there
something
now,
going on there, right?
when the hospital is actually preparing to intake all these wounded.
And I mean, a good example was during the pandemic, a lot of our hospitals had set up tents as an overflow ER. Mm-hmm. And I know one specific hospital, we had to get in there and take the tent down at night because it had gone on social media that that's where they were storing all the dead people.
Right.
And so, and I mean, it was totally false, but all of a sudden we had to change our tactics for what we were doing based on public opinion, because they thought we were bringing everyone that died to that, and it wasn't really true.
Yeah. So we've kind of talked about the historical and the common techniques. What techniques are relevant and useful as far as sorting and triaging for the dynamic case, which is again really the crux of what you're suggesting here, that we need to reimagine and rethink.
Yeah, so most of the textbook, the references are going to go back and say that the first thing you have to do is establish command and contact to get more help there, to make your call for resources, make sure that it's safe, and then you're going to start to approach the patients, and you'll see that from the start video in the bus that we've all seen, that you climb in there and you start talking, and if they answer you, then they're green, right? They're green if they can answer and follow instructions. And then once we get to them and we decide that they are not a green, they're either an alive or dead,
right.
Then we would sort out the fatalities. Now we're between the yellows and the reds, and everyone defaults to yellow unless their respirations are above this or below that, or they don't have the pulse, or they can't do the perfusion.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden they become red. And that was the standard way of doing that. Well, there's some problems with that right off the bat, was because in Las Vegas, one of the reports actually said that as they would approach patient, they say, can you move? And they would get up and they would leave, but they were actually yellow or maybe even a red.
Yeah.
All they were doing was doing what they were told to do, and they had enough consciousness to be able to say, well, I'm being ordered to do that, so I'm going to do that.
Yeah.
So we can't just
the classical
assume.
teaching is, hey, if you can hear me, come towards me, and automatically you're green, right?
Right,
Yes.
yeah. And, the other thing is that, you might see they've got blood on their shirt and possible abdominal wound, penetrating trauma. Any student in school would say that's serious. This is a yellow or a red. And yet if the person follows instructions, our teaching says no, they're following, they're green.
They're green. Yeah.
And so it doesn't really take into account that. The other thing that we see is a lot of the yellows they're going to be a red. So you might see them first and say they're clearly a yellow defined, but they could be a red in 30 seconds. They could be a red in 10 minutes.
Yeah.
They could be a red in 2 hours. So the yellows don't stay yellows for long. They're going to go to a red eventually, and a red is going to go to dead. So, our system in the RPM sequence, we really don't. We say re-triage, but we don't really push. Hey, if they're a yellow, they almost need attentive care.
Correct.
Until they get that. So that's one of the big differences when you're talking about dynamic. When you're talking about triaging, like what color are they?
Yeah, that constant re-triage specifically in that dynamic is
Which all of the drills that I've been a part of doesn't happen a lot, right? Because you're more focused on what's my problem, identifying my problem, going out there, identifying all your patients. I've sorted them, and now it goes back to retriage, but you might retriage a yellow who's now dead.
Right. And am I, as a paramedic, really very good at deciding this is a yellow or this is a red? Because it's not going to be just a straight up clean line. I might have 10 doctors, and 9 of them say this is a red. One says I think it's a yellow, and I come in with my limited experience because I haven't been on a lot of the shootings, and I'm like, I think he's a yellow. So, and we really don't want to spend a bunch of time trying to waste to go, is this a yellow? Hey, Ray, can you come over here? What do you think? Yellow or red? Like, we need to move with this.
Yeah, you're talking 30 to 45 seconds, maybe under a minute at least with each one of these patients, and you have to make that decision, and this is not something we do every day.
Right.
So the competency level, and let's face it, we do those drills, but let's face it, no one trains enough on this stuff.
Sure.
No one trains to utilize all of it, because even to put one of these trainings together is a ton of personnel, a ton of patients. We do smaller events with like TECC and, Joe Sugar, and even those 10 patients where they dress up and they're wounded and they're screaming and you're trying to triage them plus treat their injuries. That tries to make it, a high fidelity situation as best as you possibly can. And I think you hit the nail on the head there. Is we don't do it enough is what it boils down to. And then back to your point, these patients can change. So even if you did do your initial triage, and let's say you move the patient to a casualty collection point or out to your transportation officer where they're going to leave, was that patient a yellow and now they're definitely a red and they're headed to black because they've decompensated because of whatever wound they had. So it's just always changing. Those patients are always getting worse. It's not like a one and done thing, I guess would be like my overall point. It's like, okay, we sorted everybody. We're good. Everybody's got a triage tag. Nothing will change. Not to say that, but to an extent, it's like we checked the box. We did it.
This goes back to even like if you're dealing with just a regular patient that you transport every day. We talk about reassessing those patients.
Yes.
The problem is right now you're in a situation where your resources are limited, and you just don't have the time to do that. Welcome to my ER. You just don't have the time to spend as much time. So when you have that interaction with the patient, you need to be constantly reassessing them, making sure that their pulse is still stable. If I look back and go, oh, well, their pulse was 60 and now it's 90, something's changed.
Correct.
So they're showing the signs that they're getting worse very quickly. We need to intervene if we can.
Yeah. And the other thing with the dynamic was you had talked about the sifting or sorting or the ribbons, and that's one thing. One of the earliest references was in Nevada. They had come up with this, and the idea was, let's just say that it's a really busy scene. So I'll just make something up that you've got a festival in town and the Ferris wheel tips over, and you got probably 30 people injured, and it's going to be some pretty severe traumas and some extrication. Maybe some aren't so bad. So you've got a pretty good group of people, and you're the first responder, EMT or medic to show up. There's no way you could go around and get out tags and put out yellow, and you just can't do that because, like you said about being overwhelmed.
Or set up a tarp. What do you do? Like, you got people, a sea of people waiting to be triaged. And
so one of the tricks is
making a bed.
And we could we could do a discussion, is that a dynamic or a static event? Well, you've got so many people, there's a little bit of chaos running. Maybe somebody says that, it happened because somebody put a bomb in it. I feel like that's probably a dynamic event right there because it's going to be very chaotic and people can flee the scene and they might want to.
And there's personal vehicles there and they can go get their loved one, collect them, take them to the local ER.
Yes.
Even before people, if it's not a staffed event, right, if there's not EMS already standing by there, it might take 5 minutes for them to respond, or at worst, let's say it's a smaller event, let's say like a street event going on, they aren't staffing it, it's a volunteer fire department, they call in the volunteer who shows up with, just his bag.
Sure.
And then there's already 3 people at the emergency department that have gone by private vehicle and or police.
Yeah.
Right.
And you have all those bystanders now that have all started to do something.
Yeah.
They've all wanted
and
to help.
There's going to be a doc in the group. There's going to be nurses out there. Then there's going to be paramedics and EMTs. They're all going to be responding to this chaotic situation.
Right.
Yes.
So in a situation like that, where I'm by myself and I have 30 and I need to assess them quickly, what I really need to do is just need to sift and sort. I need to figure out who's alive, who's ambulatory and who is not alive, or expectant. In other words, there's no way he's going to survive that injury, even though it looks like he's trying to breathe.
Trying to, right?
Yeah. So in that case, they suggest using the ribbons, and instead of going with the red, the yellow, and the green ribbon, you would just use these two, and that's going to be an orange and then a black-white. So the black-white zebra is much more visible at night than the straight, just glossy black. Yeah. So they suggest using that one. When you buy a commercial kit like this, they do have the green, the yellow, the red, and then they've got this. This is a simple one that you can buy at the hardware store, surveying tape of orange.
Yeah.
And basically, all I'm going to do is concentrate on these two. And so as I approach those people, if I've got one kind of walk in holding his arm, I'm just going to say, if you can hear me and you can do it, I need you to go over there to the gate right there where that gentleman is, and that's where we're going to start to make a casualty collection point, if you will. But you're basically sending anybody who can follow. Now, remember, this could be a green, it could be a yellow, it could be a red. We don't know yet.
Right.
But all we know is they're ambulatory.
Yeah.
So we don't have to move them. They can move themselves right now. Let's have them move now. So we get them to move. Then the next thing we do is we come across somebody, and they are a fatality. This person is not alive. What we want to do for sure is we want to tag them. And I was a firm believer for a lot of my career that this is probably the wasted tag. Like, who cares? Like, they're like, why would you use the black tags? But in that Las Vegas
I'm about to say,
AAR,
you said some.
The Las Vegas just came right out and said they had video cameras that would see them checking the same fatality over and over. What a waste of resources.
They're obviously dead, right?
Yeah.
But you don't know that until you assess
until
them.
you look at them, until you roll them over, whatever, and look, and then go, oh. And so they said, the smartest thing you can do is take this ribbon, about 3-4 foot long, tear it off, tie it on an arm, a leg, or whatever, and leave it heading towards the walkway.
Yeah.
So it's very obvious.
Yeah.
And then this also comes into play a little later, and I'll explain it. But basically, we're saying don't waste your time. Part of the crime scene now, not a victim.
All right.
Then anyone who can't follow our instructions, they're going to get an orange. Orange is kind of cool because it's kind of a mix of red and yellow, right? We don't know what they are, but we do know that they are not ambulatory and they need to be littered out. Now, what happens now is as I start to get rescuers show up, I can get the casualty collection point staffed with an ambulance. But then what I can do is I can, as they start to get volunteers there that are willing to help because every one of these, you look at the pictures, you're going to see, good Samaritans who are carrying victims and wanting to help.
What can I do? Sure.
Yeah, they usually don't have a shirt on. And they're just looking to help, So you grab these two guys and you give them, a drag sled or a sheet or a cot or a backboard or a reeves.
Whatever you got.
Whatever. And you just give them one of those and go, here's what I need you to do. I need you to go over there by the Ferris wheel. Don't get near the Ferris wheel. It's dangerous. But I want you to find anyone with an orange tag,
and move them.
Put them on there, and bring them to me right here. If you see this one, keep on walking.
Do
nothing to see here. So what that does now is it's using volunteers, which almost every after action says you've got volunteers that want to help. How do you use them? Well, this is a great way because I can kind of rapidly sift and sort the patients and then have them bring them to an actual triage, casualty collection point, whatever you want to call it. And there might be multiple of those. I think Las Vegas had 3 separate. I know that Aurora had at least 2, maybe 3. So because the victims kind of deploy where they're going to deploy, so they become that casualty collection point.
And by using the Good Samaritans, it's also helping your resources because that's very labor intensive. And one thing we talk about in TECC is you're only going to be able to move so many people before you're tired.
Sure.
So if there's a line of people that want to help, moving people is very labor intensive. So putting them to work is going to allow the medical providers that are on the scene to perform medical treatment, while the lay provider, essentially, if you will, or the bystander is just going to move them versus exhausting all of your medical providers moving everyone. And then now it's like, oh, I have to treat you. Well, I'm exhausted. I'm tired. I'm sweating, right? Because you don't know how big that footprint is either. How far is that at a fair? I look at if you took it out for this scenario that you're talking about, Donnie, we're talking about, a smaller a smaller street fair or something in a smaller community, take that, big spread. If we had to move somebody at Canfield Fair, you're talking huge footprint. How far away are we going to have to move them? Las Vegas, those footprints are massive. So how far do we actually have to move these people to get them to the casualty collection point to be able to be transported? So,
and the providers with the knowledge and experience, they're going to be the ones figuring out red, yellow, green here.
Yes.
Once they're at that collection point, right?
Right. Someone with more experience is going to be great for
it
that.
Has to be, right.
Sure.
Well, that's how we do in the hospital, right? If we're in a disaster mode and you're bringing us all these patients, they get re-triaged, and the expectation is the most experienced person is that triage person at the door re-triaging them, typically either going to be like the ER doc with the most experience and or the trauma surgeon if you're a trauma center that's really triaging these people to say where they need to go.
Right. Yeah, we want them to say, oh, no, that one's going right to surgery.
Yep.
I've seen this before.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, the other thing I want to say also is that the example I gave you was we're moving these patients out, but that doesn't always happen. You don't always have to move them. It's nicer if you can kind of group them, the reds by the reds, yellows by the yellows, but that's actually where this other ribbon comes in, is you can actually, tie some long yellows on one guy that's over there because you just don't have the manpower to move them. Yeah. You just put a long yellow on his leg. Right. Once he's re-triaged to an actual color, and then you can tell him, go get a yellow, or your next ambulance in with the cot, you're like, go in there and find a yellow. The other thing is that a lot of times in your standard book, the old static way of doing things is you're going to get them to the tarp. And I'd seen it at drills where they bring the patient out of the school or out of the church or out of the business for this drill, and they're obviously a red. They have a pretty good gunshot wound to their chest, and they're unresponsive. And then they move the patient right to the red tarp outside, and then they start assessing, and you have 3 ambulances waiting.
Right. Yeah.
And so obviously the goal is to make sure we're not putting greens in an ambulance and wasting the resource.
Yep.
But in real life, you wouldn't do that. You'd be like, no, just put her in the ambulance. Like, she's a red. She's clearly a red. We don't have to stop at the red tarp for permission.
GSW to the chest.
Exactly.
I don't need to know much more.
Exactly.
Chest seals and go.
Right.
Yeah. So then in that situation, back to the Ferris wheel, we may actually have an orange who's like, they litter out an orange, and we're like, you know what? I didn't even have a chance to assess them, but I don't care. You got an ambulance right there. Put them in and get going. Right. Because it's first one out, and it's either a yellow or a red. We know that.
Mm-hmm. So 2 points. Let's back up a little bit to using volunteers and using, using people in the environment. One of the other things I recall in your presentation was talking about having a cache of throw kits for some of these situations. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, I believe it was the Las Vegas after action back in 2017 where they didn't have enough bags with stop the bleed kits in there and ribbon. And so one of the recommendations from that report was to have more throw bags, and that's what they called them, was they took a bag similar to what this Smart Triage pack size is, and inside it had basically 2 ribbons, the orange and the black-white, and then it also had in there some things that you would use for TECC or Rescue Task Force. So probably some tourniquets, maybe some bleeding control, hemostatic, maybe some needle decompression needles. But basically, as rescuers arrive off duty, or you've got somebody who says, I'm a nurse, what can I do? You throw them this bag.
Yeah.
Actually just throw it to them, and then they're going to use what they can use in there,
That whole presentation and the stuff that you had spoke about with the throw kits, actually on the UH side of things with all of our ground ambulances, we had those vacuum sealed IFACs.
Yep.
And we just threw them in a little cinch bag.
Sure.
And we put them in with our mega mover and our body bag and our RTF stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
Just for that reason, right? We
Sure.
show up on scene, people willing to help, able to help, cops, whomever. I mean, because
Right.
they're, even in the cops, okay, great, they've got a tourniquet on them. Those are, used immediately.
Yeah, sure.
Something to replenish with. So now we just have a grab bag full of sealed IFACs based on on that experience.
Right.
So.
And when we were talking about this, I know there was some discussions with the Stop the Bleed for law enforcement versus EMS. Like, what about the needle decompression needles? Do we want those in law enforcement? So, like the Ohio State Highway Patrol was one we did a lot of classes for up here and helped supply their cars. And, our argument was, I want the needle decompression needle in there because if I'm driving down the road as a paramedic and I see, like when you see it, you're not going to be like, oh, I wonder what this does. Should I try this? I think I stick it somewhere in their chest. But it's going to be one of us is going to look at it and go, I know exactly what that is, and that's exactly what he needs. Look in there and see if you see a small orange magic marker in there.
Do you have more?
Yeah. So, we feel like that needs to be there because you don't want to open it and not have it if you need it.
Yeah, it's easier to tell them, just ignore that if you don't know what that is.
Right.
Yeah. But, it's nice if we show up and somebody else shows up.
Yeah, a lot of them won't even know how to open it.
Right.
I think one of the things that comes up in all these after-action reports is command and communication. So when reviewing them, communication is always something that could be improved upon. First guy that shows up is either going to be white and black, deceased, move on, orange tag. The walking wounded are going to go to the collection point.
Right.
You're going to have more resources start to show up. They're going to start they're going to start after we sorted them out, so that way we know they're walking, they're orange, or they're deceased. We're going to start then triaging them into typically red, yellow, or green. What time should we set up unified communications, or set up that actual true command structure to start to actually try to organize the chaos that's going on?
So obviously, unified command is the answer. Generally speaking, in the U.S., fire EMS was a little more into incident command than law enforcement was. I think most of law enforcement these days has realized it is a component. We're used to working as a team in EMS, where they're used to working more like individually. So there's a little bit of a mismatch. And then when we try to work together to get unified command, which we know is the right answer, it may not happen right away. I mean, if you look at what the police officer's list of things to do and our list of things to do, our incident command is right up at the top, but they have to take out the shooter first. They have to stop the threat. That is first. And then after that, they need to start to, protect the area and stuff. And so incident command is down there. So this is one of those, I don't think there's anything that's a national standard. I think probably it's going to be more of a municipality thing. When you read, Uvalde, the Robb Elementary, that, I believe it was mostly smaller departments, EMS-wise, mostly volunteers, and it was a very rural area, and that, the police had their thing going on, and the after action said that EMS, wasn't really aware of what they needed or where, and, they didn't realize there was a helicopter there, so they went to a different helicopter, and so communication is always a problem, but that's really something for, Texas to figure out in their jurisdiction. So I don't think there's a real good standard. I think that every agency has to realize what's my target hazards. Well, I have a football stadium, a high school football stadium, and that's our biggest target hazard in my town. And so how do I work with my sheriff's department, my constable, my police department, the private security, whatever it is? How do I work with the state police that if something happens in my target hazard, how are we going to communicate? Because, I know Aurora was on different radio systems at the time, so they really couldn't talk too well. They were using, a third-party ambulance, Rural Metro, I think it was. So you had like 3 different entities, which isn't uncommon, and then you start adding those in. And so the big thing is really working with your law enforcement. And I remember that when I worked at the fire department, they were really starting to put a lot of these active shooter panic buttons in. And one time in dispatch, I asked them, well, what does that actually call? And then they showed me the list. And so you might have a department say, oh, yeah, we work with our police department all the time. We work really good. We know exactly what to do. They're all on the rescue task force, TECC. Oh, yeah, we do that and everything. Like, do you realize who's coming? Like, you're going to have the park system there. You're going to have the Department of Natural Resources. You got 2 people walking around Chardon High School with an FBI shirt on. Like, how did that happen
Where
so
did they
fast?
come from? Yeah.
Yeah,
Yep.
I mean, you're going to get all of these law enforcement, and I don't think they're all trained to the same level. So I think that it's a goal that you have to work on and just continue. So to get back to your question about when is that unified command, I know some departments that we've been involved with where we help do some of the training with them. I've seen them where fire goes ahead and starts the unified command and basically tries to get up to the building as close as they can safely do. And then the first time they get a police officer going in, they can start to announce, hey, I'm incident commander, so once you figure it out, get somebody out here. And then that I kind of like personally that way the best if that works for them. But that'll get you unified command as early as possible. You may have some bigger departments where they have fire and police, and basically the deputy chief or commander or division or whatever precinct commander from police shows up, and they're not going to go in because everybody else is in. Their actually job is to create unified command with fire.